I will go ahead and tell you guys, in the interest of making sure that we get the most out of this hour, we are not allowing folks to come off of mute tonight. However, at any point during the event tonight, you can submit questions that you'd like to see us answer via the chat function, and Damon and I will be moderating the Q&A at the end and reading those questions aloud. And then Brian will be answering them to the best of our ability. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian and let him kick it off by walking us through that consent order.
All right, thanks, Emily. Appreciate the introduction. Before I go through the consent order, I really want to thank the Board of Supervisors and the staff of Upper Makefield Township for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion tonight. In addition, I really also want to thank the folks in the task force, the non-air task force, and all the local residents for your involvement and efforts to keep all of us accountable in this situation. You've also had some very strong local and state political leadership who've additionally supported you in this effort. There have been a number of local regulatory bodies, including the Department of of Environmental Protection, Departments of Health, who have been very critical in this, in our response and the work we're doing. And really, this effort has all been really important to keeping us on task. I really appreciate everyone's involvement and efforts. As Emily mentioned, we do have a consent agreement and consent order in place. The consent agreement was entered between Sunoco and PHMSA, and the consent agreement's requirements apply to the entire Twin Oak pipeline system, not just the section of the line where the failure occurred. And this is to help ensure that the conditions that led to the pipeline failure do not exist anywhere else on the pipeline system, and that the pipeline system can continue to operate safely. These requirements became effective on May 2nd, 2025, when the consent order was issued by PHMSA following the informal consultations between PHMSA and Sunoco. Now, first and foremost, the consent order requires Sunoco to maintain the 20% pressure reduction on the pipeline that's been in place since the discovery of the failure. Sunoco has had to submit pressure data to PHMSA on a monthly basis so that we can continue and confirm that they're abiding by the limitation of this 20% reduction. In addition, this pressure reduction will stay in place until I grant them written approval to remove it, which will happen potentially down the line as the various measures are taken as part of the consent agreement. Secondly, the consent order has measures which ensure that a thorough investigation is completed to fully understand how this accident happened, and in order to prevent anything similar from occurring to this pipeline system in the future, with the goal of applying any lessons to be learned to other company pipeline systems and ultimately to other hazardous liquid pipeline operators. There are 3 investigations that Sunoco has to conduct under the consent order and consent agreement. A failure history evaluation, which is an attempt to determine how long the leak was going on. The results of this evaluation will inform the next requirement, which is a leak detection evaluation. PHMSA regulations require operators to have a leak detection system in place on their pipelines. The evaluation will push Sunoco to identify any vulnerabilities in their existing system. It will also include a review of Sunoco's inspection and maintenance plans and their right-of-way inspection program. Sunoco is also required to implement continuing long-term periodic testing and integrity verification measures under this investigation. The third investigation that Sunoco is required to conduct is a root cause failure analysis. And this is intended to look into all the factors that contributed to the failure. And all 3 of these investigations are being conducted by reputable third-party entities, which have been approved by my office, and the company has to submit these reports to us for review and approval. If we review the reports and don't find them sufficient, we can direct Sunoco to address the deficiencies in the reports. In addition, Sunoco was required to submit the failed pipe to an independent third-party contractor for metallurgical testing, and those reports have been submitted to the agency for review. Third aspect of the consent agreement is that there are a series of measures that require the company to investigate the overall state of their pipeline operations in general to prevent other harms to this community and other communities. So there is a Type A sleeve integrity plan, which requires the company to evaluate the integrity of every Type A sleeve on the pipeline system. As you may recall from discussions, there were 44 Type A sleeves installed, and they are required to evaluate the integrity of all these sleeves. Sunoco must remove from the pipeline any type A sleeve whose integrity cannot be reasonably assured as a part of this evaluation process. And for any type A sleeve that Sunoco proposes to leave in place, they must submit a technical justification, including a description of the additional integrity management measures that will be implemented to ensure the safety and integrity of the pipeline. Separately, the consent order also required the performance of a ground instrument leakage survey or the excavation and evaluation of all type A sleeves on the pipeline. Sunoco was required to investigate and remedy any leaks that are indicated by that survey. And this survey has been recently conducted, and we have that data, and we're currently reviewing the data from the leak survey. In addition, Sunoco is required to develop and submit to PHMSA a remedial work plan which ties together all the elements which we've just covered above, the investigations and the various measures. The results of these many evaluations and tests required by other parts of the agreement will inform Sunoco of the work of what they need to actually do in order to ensure the safety of the pipeline. The remedial work plan also requires the company to investigate other areas of the pipeline with similar characteristics to the failure location and determine if there are similar risks at those locations, and if so, investigate and repair those areas to mitigate those risks. Also, the company has had to review and assess the effectiveness of their emergency response plans and training, as well as their public awareness program, and amend those procedures based on what they find. The emergency response plan covers how Sunoco interacts with first responders, as well as public officials, and the emergency training program they provide their employees in case of future accidents. Sunoco's public awareness program addresses how the operator interacts with members of the public in communities like yours, where their assets are located. One thing that would really improve the effectiveness of these reviews is if any of you or any members of the community are contacted by the operator, by Sunoco, as a part of these emergency response plan or public awareness program reviews. We encourage you to respond to the operator and provide honest feedback so that the company can incorporate what you tell them into their lessons learned for these reviews. Fourth and finally, the consent order ensures that PHMSA can pursue additional enforcement against the operator should it fail to comply with any element of the agreement. Our investigation into the failure is active and ongoing. However, should we determine that Sunoco isn't meeting the terms of the agreement, we can pursue additional enforcement. If during the course of our investigation we discover new information that leads us to believe additional safety measures are necessary, the agency can and will seek to modify the terms of the agreement or pursue additional safety action. One thing that it's important to understand, and I made mention of this before in our previous discussions, is that really the purpose of these investigations and enforcement actions are to be able to take the lessons learned holistically across this system, across other Sunoco systems, and then ultimately across the regulated pipeline network. And we believe that what we've come, the elements of the consent agreement will drive change, important change in how this operator operates their pipeline system and potentially important changes for the rest of the regulated hazardous liquid pipeline network. And so that's my overview of this for you. And hopefully between this and the documents which we provided to the township, in which I know folks have had provided to them, there's additional information in there, but hopefully this overview provides you the background you need to understand where we're headed on this consent agreement.
Thank you, Brian. Before we dive into the questions that were submitted to us by the Board of Supervisors, Brian and I did want to just take a brief moment to address some common themes that we've noticed in some of the questions that we've already received. So one thing we're going to do is, before we jump in, Brian is going to give a brief overview of kind of the basics of what PHMSA does when it comes to inspections and what triggers an investigation, just to kind of explain our jurisdiction and how our basic processes work. And then I wanted to take a moment just to address, we've gotten a number of questions about when the public is going to have access to some of these documents and reports that Brian has covered that are part of the consent order. So I just wanted to talk through briefly We want to be as transparent as we possibly can be with the public. That being said, the way for you to access any documents that you're looking to get from the agency is to go through the Freedom of Information Act process. That's something that there's information about on PHMSA's website, but you guys are also able to reach out to our community liaisons if you need help navigating that process. What I will tell you though is that under FOIA, and FOIA is a federal statute that applies not just to the Department of Transportation and PHMSA, but to all federal agencies. One thing I will tell you is there is an exemption that applies to information that is being shared with the agency as part of an active law enforcement investigation. And so you are most likely to have success at accessing those documents that you're interested in once our investigation is concluded. There are going to be some limitations on what we're able to share publicly while we are still conducting an active investigation of what went wrong and working through that with the operator. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there because I know we've gotten a lot of questions about when you all will be able to see some of that information. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to just kind of briefly walk through a little bit of a PHMSA inspection and investigation 101.
All right, so thanks, Emily. So I'm just going to touch on jurisdiction briefly. We have authority under the Pipeline Safety Act to prescribe and enforce minimum safety standards for pipeline facilities and pipeline transportation, including the transportation of natural gas and hazardous liquids by pipeline. Our regulations are promulgated in the Code of Federal Regulations, 49 CFR Parts 190 through 199, which govern pipeline design, construction, operation, maintenance, amongst other things. Within the Office of Pipeline Safety, we administer a National Pipeline Safety Inspection and Enforcement Program, which is intended to assure compliance with our federal pipeline safety regulations. It's important to note that activities currently undertaken by other local, state, and federal regulatory agencies would generally fall outside of our jurisdiction. For example, activities related to the interim and full remediation of hydrocarbons that are being overseen by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection are outside of our regulatory and safety authority, although we remain an active participant in the weekly update discussions between Sunoco and the environmental agencies, and we review the reports submitted to those agencies on a daily basis. And so we are active and involved, but we don't necessarily have jurisdiction over certain aspects of the current activities. Talking a little bit about our inspection and investigation process. So as part of our oversight responsibility, we conduct safety inspections of pipeline systems that we oversee. And we base these inspections on identified risk information, and we define and design each inspection specifically for the pipeline being inspected. These inspections combine elements of various safety inspections, such as operations and maintenance, pipeline operator qualifications, integrity management, for example, into a single inspection. And the majority of our pipeline system inspections are these what we call integrated inspections, although we always have an option to perform a more specialized inspection based on the identified risks for the pipeline system under inspection. So for example, we conduct an inspection, we find a specific issue, we'll dig into it. We'll peel the onion until we determine where the issues lie and where the areas that the operator are potentially non-complying. In addition, we have a risk-informed approach to determine the frequency of inspection for each pipeline system we oversee. A risk model has been developed, which calculates a score based on a combination of threat and consequent factors and other data maintained in our pipeline data repository. And our policy requires that pipeline systems with a high-risk ratings be inspected every 3 years, medium risk ratings every 5 years, and low risk ratings every 7 years. However, any pipeline system may be inspected at any time with notice to an operator. So if there's an area that we have a concern about, we can really inspect at any time based on our concerns and with notice to an operator. For every pipeline system to be inspected, we develop a profile of the system, we analyze the data, we have a screening process, and we basically will then develop a set of questions to ask utilizing a software tool which our inspectors use. And then we'll perform procedure records and field inspections and observations of actual activities that the operator undertakes. So it's a fairly structured and rigorous process to conduct these inspections. And these are intended to provide assurance that pipeline operators are meeting our regulatory requirements. Now, there are cases where an accident or an incident occurs. And in those cases, we have a separate accident investigation team, which are poised to deploy at a moment's notice to begin the initial investigation process. We typically supplement the accident investigation team with region staff, region inspectors. And for example, when an accident occurs, the operator is required to notify us immediately within an hour of the accident or incident occurring, and that triggers our accident investigation process to kick off. Depending on the nature of the accident or incident, we may decide to deploy investigators, or we may decide to just allow the operator to provide updates depending on the nature of the accident or incident. One thing that's really critically important is that we typically do try to provide additional region inspectors to supplement the accident investigation team in the event that the accident is a result of a potential noncompliance by the operator. It allows our trained investigators to understand what may be the causal factors of the accident or incident, and it allows us separately, the region, to understand what regulatory items were potentially not complied with in order to both understand the causal factors for the accident as well as any potential enforcement we may need to overlay on the operator for not meeting our regulatory compliance or requirements. So that's a brief overview of our jurisdiction and the inspection investigation process.
Thank you, Brian. So I think with that, we're going to turn to the questions that we received from the board. And Damon is going to be our moderator and read those questions for you all so that Brian can answer.
First question from the township is, the township has been told by the responsible party that the evaluation of the inline inspection data is being fast-tracked. However, to date, no information has been shared with the township relative to the results of the inspections and the integrity of the pipeline traversing the township. When will this information be shared?
So thanks, Damon. So as everyone knows, the immediate leak was repaired, pressure reduction was put into place, and we issued the notice of proposed safety order, and now we have our consent agreement in place. The inline inspection tools were run, as you may recall, as briefed by Sunoco during both town hall meetings as well as their subsequent calls. They ran a number of inline inspection tools in the pipeline system, including those looking for dents and deformations, looking for metal loss, and looking for cracks. And the metal loss and crack tools were used using ultrasonic technology. The operator has indicated that those reports are underway, and we are separately awaiting the results of those reports. When the operator receives those from their inline inspection vendor, they will submit them to us for immediate review as well. We do not have those currently, but we are expecting them fairly soon, within the next few weeks, for PHMSA review.
Thank you, Brian. Second question is from the township. It is understood that the inline inspections traverse the entirety of the pipeline. The township has requested that the data review focus first on the segment of the pipeline that traverses the township. Has this triage approach been approved, and will it be implemented?
So thank you for the question, Damon. So we did approach the operator about the potential for looking at a focused review of the data within the township, as well, and then looking at the entirety of the pipeline. In discussions between the pipeline operator, their technical staff, and the companies provided the inline inspection tools. In order to best expedite the delivery of the reports and data from the tool runs, it was decided to work to deliver the analysis of the entire pipeline system versus that prioritized delivery of a subset of data in the township. As you may recall, we did a number of excavations of the Type A sleeves closest to the township back in February. Those excavations were performed. Those sites were inspected by our investigators and our inspectors, and those sites were determined to be in satisfactory condition. In addition, the non-sleeve portions of the pipeline throughout the township did not show areas of excessive pipe wall thinning in the prior inline inspections. And so based on the totality of the information, we gave them to go ahead to continue to just deliver the full data set. And as I mentioned, we are expecting the delivery of the inline inspection results to PHMSA within the next few weeks for our review.
The next question is, the PHMSA order and agreement provides corrective measures, including the replacement of sleeves. Are there sleeves that still exist in the segment of the pipeline that need to be replaced? If so, when will this work be scheduled?
So Sunoco is required by the consent agreement and consent order to evaluate all the type A sleeves in the pipeline to determine if replacement is needed. And any necessary replacements will be included in the remedial work plan for the pipeline. I will note that in previous discussions with both in person as well as during the calls that the operator had, the intent of the operator is to excavate and remove a significant number of the type A sleeves. We don't have the remedial work plan. We don't have the type A sleeve evaluation, but we anticipate that evaluation will include a significant amount of sleeve removal.
Thanks, Brian. The age and construction characteristics of the pipeline and the potential for additional releases remains a concern. Is there monitoring instrumentation that can be installed to forewarn of releases?
Yep, thanks, Damon. As we mentioned before, our pipeline regulations require the operator to have an effective leak detection system in place. One of the elements of the consent order and agreement is, of course, to evaluate the leak detection system, evaluate the potential corrective measures to prove effectiveness of the leak detection system, and then to implement corrective measures which would demonstrably result in improving the capability of the leak detection system, considering the latest advancements in leak detection technology. So part of the output of this leak detection system evaluation would be to determine what additional measures that they need to install to assure the protection of the areas where the public are threatened by the potential for a leak. We expect that to come out of this evaluation.
All right. The next question from the township is, please explain the relationship between the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and PHMSA. And does PHMSA monitor product recovery and the site characterization process?
Yep, thanks, Damon. So, we are the federal pipeline safety regulator, and our investigation and consent order are focused on ensuring that the pipeline is operating safely and in compliance with our regulations. We investigate whether the conditions that led to this failure could exist elsewhere in the pipeline, and whether any necessary safety measures are in place to prevent another incident or accident. Product recovery and cleanup after the incident is outside of our jurisdiction and is handled by the relevant state environmental agency. In this case, it's the Pennsylvania DEP. Like I mentioned, we are involved in frequent meetings and discussions with the DEP, as well as with the discussions between the operator and DEP on the remediation. And we are reviewing, and I am personally reviewing on a daily basis the report submitted from the operator to the DEP to understand the current condition of the remediation process. But again, that falls fully under the jurisdiction of DEP, but we will provide any assistance or any support as requested.
The next question is, point of entry treatment systems were installed on resident wells as an interim response to impacted water supplies. Residents have voiced concern about the use of these systems as a final remedy for groundwater. The township has developed an outline for a feasibility study to evaluate other potential long-term water supply options. The township requests that the feasibility study be considered a corrective action and that the responsible parties reimburse the township for professional and legal services related to the feasibility study.
Similar to the previous question, this is really outside of PHMSA's jurisdiction. Water quality issues are not in our jurisdiction. Related measures would best be discussed with the Pennsylvania DEP. Sitting through the meetings, I think the DEP recognizes some of these concerns. And again, I would ask you just to address those with DEP.
Thank you, Brian. Next question is, has the estimated quantity of the release been calculated?
So the current estimated release amount was reported to be 156 barrels by the operator. The spill estimates will be updated as the investigation continues. As we've discussed in prior meetings, there have been certain work along with when the failed component, for example, was removed and taken to the metallurgical laboratory. There was work to attempt to characterize the leak rate. That information has been developed and reported by the company doing the metallurgical evaluation, and it's part of our current investigation. Again, the estimated release amount is reported at 156 barrels, but those estimates will be updated as part of the investigation.
And the township was told that high volume vacuum extraction product recovery events would be conducted. However, to date, recovery has been limited to the use of low volume pumping and absorbent socks in 3 shallow wells near the slice of the release, with only a few gallons per day being recovered. Given that the quantity of the release was estimated to be over 150 barrels, the township believes a more aggressive recovery effort is indicated. Has PHMSA consulted with PADEP on the current status of recovery efforts and provided insight based on PHMSA's experience with other pipeline releases similar in scope?
So, similar to prior answers, of course, we're aware and we're involved in the discussions related to the ongoing recovery efforts, thanks to the information shared by the Pennsylvania DEP. Again, we do not have the jurisdiction, and frankly, DEP has considerable expertise in cleanup and recovery. And so questions related to cleanup and recovery, we defer to DEP.
Thank you. What are the leak detection system technologies that PHMSA requires of operators like Energy Transfer?
So as mentioned before, our regulations require that a pipeline must have an effective system for detecting leaks. There are certain definitions in our code related to an effective system. For example, in a high consequence area, which this part of your neighborhood where the release occurred is, the operators must evaluate the capability of its leak detection system and then modify if necessary to protect the high consequence area. But that's part of our regulation. The operator's evaluation must consider factors such as the length and size of the pipeline, the type of product carried, proximity to the high consequence area, in this case, right through your neighborhood, how quickly the leak detection system can detect the leak, location of nearest response personnel, any leak history, risk assessment results. These are part of code requirements for leak detection systems in high consequence areas. And so in this case, these are the things that are part of what we'll be evaluating in our investigation, as well as the evaluation as part of the consent agreement by the independent third party. But in general, an effective leak detection system is what's required, especially in high consequence areas for operators such as Energy Transfer.
Right. Next question is, are those systems monitored by PHMSA for compliance?
So as I mentioned earlier, our inspection program looks at pipeline systems on a periodic basis. We aren't resourced to provide full-time monitoring of any pipeline system. I will say that there are cases we have had fairly intrusive oversight and typically in the recovery from incidents and accidents of operators. But in general, like I mentioned earlier in the call, our system looks at a periodic review of pipeline systems, of procedures, records, observations in the field to assure that pipeline operators are meeting our regulatory requirements. We do, like I mentioned, we access operator procedures, records as part of our inspection and enforcement processes. Those are the kind of things that we monitor. But that's the level of monitoring that's typically done to assure compliance is procedures, records, observations to assure that the operators are doing what they're supposed to be doing to meet the regulatory requirements.
Right. And the last question that we have from the township is the age and construction characteristics of the pipeline and the potential for additional releases remain a concern. Is there monitoring instrumentation that can be installed to forewarn of releases, i.e. monitoring systems that monitor 24/7 with leakage notification? We are trying to understand the nature of the technology out there.
Now, that's a good question. And again, the investigation will show us where the opportunities for improvement or potentially leveraging different tools or systems to address, the causes of this failure, as well as the ability to quickly detect leaks that are a result of these types of releases. Leak detection technology is a priority for PHMSA and the industry, and there's research ongoing as we see continual improvements. There's actually an open advance notice of proposed rulemaking where the agency is seeking feedback on how we can update our regulations to allow operators to better leverage new and improving technologies. But just from a big picture perspective, there are different flavors of leak detection systems that have been developed. Anything from visual leak detection to discrete sensor-based technologies that detect liquids or vapors or acoustic emissions, for example. There are computational methods which will automatically calculate what we call over-short comparisons, the amount of product put into the pipeline versus the amount of product that leaves the pipeline. If there's a difference, that could indicate a leak. Rate of change of pressure or statistical methods, discrepancies between modeled and measured parameters in the system. So there are a number of different technologies that are out there. The goal of our consent agreement and consent order is to have an evaluation to determine the best way to implement a leak detection system on this pipeline system to protect you, the public. And so this is all part of what's going to come out of the investigation, as well as consent order and consent agreement.
Thank you both. So we have been going through the chat and pulling some questions out. So Damon and I, Brian, are going to kind of tag team reading some of these for you as we continue to go through what's been submitted. But let's start with, we've gotten a question about Sunoco has stated that Energy Transfer utilizes a leak detection system that is the most advanced system available to the pipeline transportation industry. Does PHMSA consider this to be true on the Twin Oaks pipeline?
So what I will say is that part of our consent agreement is to evaluate the effectiveness of the leak detection system and to determine what technologies could potentially be implemented to improve that. What I would say is that, at the end of the day, there was a release that was not detected by their leak detection system. It was detected frankly, by the folks who are detecting the smell in your drinking water. So are there opportunities to improve upon the leak detection system? We think so, but we need to let, the investigation, the independent third-party investigation, review the totality of the information to really determine everything from, the duration, the nature, the amount, and the other technologies which are frankly available and which could provide that improvement opportunity. I believe Sunoco could do better, and Sunoco should do better, and you deserve better as the folks who live next to this pipeline.
Thanks, Brian. And we've gotten a few different variations on this question, but why is the pipeline allowed to operate when we don't know if the pipeline is leaking at any of those other type A sleeves? Another leak could be happening undetected by the operator.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So right now, we have no evidence that the pipeline poses a danger to the public. The original leak was repaired. We reviewed and approved the repair and return to service plans, and the operator implemented them. We have no other evidence of any active or imminent leaks at this time. And again, the measures in the consent order and consent agreement that we've covered today are there in place to ensure the safety of operations. If we felt that there was a danger or an imminent threat or an active threat, I would not hesitate to take this to my boss and my boss's boss and to the acting administrator and make a different recommendation.
Thanks, Brian. So the next one is, what are the repercussions if Sunoco is identified to have had no or a non-effective emergency response plan? They should not be receiving credit for our community's response to the crisis they caused.
So that's a good question, and I want to make it clear. Part of the reason why we added or we ensured that this was in the consent agreement was so that the operator could really take a good hard look as to how they responded and then how they separately reached out to the local responders, emergency responders as part of this. We took the discussions by the public very seriously about, we had no idea what was going on. They were excavating. That's not really fully acceptable, including the discussions with your emergency response officials who said the same thing. And so we wanted to make it clear as part of our consent order and consent agreement that they really need to look at how they do their business with regards to emergency response, to informing local officials, informing emergency responders, informing the public, keeping you aware of what's going on with their system. Based on the totality of what we've seen over the last number of months, it's fairly clear to me that there should be some improvement opportunities there. So we made sure to include those as part of the consent agreement. The operator needs to sharpen their pencil, review, and make changes, make improvements to satisfy you and to satisfy us that they know what to do should another, God forbid, another release occur.
Thanks, Brian. So I think the next one we have for you, and you may have touched on this already, but ETP used a pig recently that can detect cracks. When will we have those results?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, they did a series of inline inspection runs, a series of tool runs to include, again, a tool which looks for deformations or dents, as well as tools to look for cracks on the pipeline, as well as a tool to look for metal loss. Something that's a little different this time than before, and you may remember for those folks who were in the public meetings that were held, as well as on the calls that Sunoco had with to discuss their progress. In prior inspections, they primarily used a magnetic flux leakage tool, which is basically a tool which used magnets to magnetize the pipeline and determine the amount of metal loss in the pipeline, which is a perfectly good technology, and it's worked really well for the industry. Problem is there are limitations with the magnetic flux tool, especially on a pipeline where you're doing a number of repairs using sleeves. When you add a metal sleeve to a metal pipeline, you effectively make the magnetic flux tool blind in those areas. They had run one ultrasonic tool a couple of years ago, but it wasn't part of their regular integrity program. And so that's an area which, frankly, I would consider deficient by the operator. And as we do our investigation, we'll comment more on that. However, an ultrasonic tool is a better technology. It's not impacted by the presence of the external metal from the sleeve, and will give us a better indication, certainly at the sleeve locations, of any metal loss or cracks which may occur. And if you remember, the cause of this specific accident was at the location of a dent which had a sleeve on it, was a stress corrosion cracking. In effect, water was able to get inside the sleeve in an area where you wouldn't expect it to be and cause stress corrosion cracking at the location of the dent. And so utilizing these ultrasonic tools, utilizing the deformation tool, the operator should get a very clear picture of what's happening along the entire pipeline, but in particular in the sleeved areas where, again, where this accident occurred.
Thanks, Brian. So I think the next question we have for you is, I'm actually going to ask this as a two-part question because there are a couple of related ones that were submitted. What is the New Jersey DEP and the New Jersey PHMSA office doing to enforce the order in New Jersey? Who at New Jersey DEP is in charge of the investigation of type A sleeves? And then a related question, is PHMSA soliciting any input from the Trenton, New Jersey office for local perspective, or are all decisions on the pipeline made by people in Texas and DC? And one more that is also on the same subject, since a significant portion of the Twin Oaks pipeline is in New Jersey, can you tell us what involvement or interest New Jersey has shown in this investigation?
So as it stands, we are the regulator for the pipeline system itself. So when it comes to anything related to the type A sleeves, regardless of the state, that falls up rolls up to PHMSA as the pipeline regulator. And so the Southwest region, as we've mentioned in prior meetings and discussions, has oversight of Energy Transfer as an operator, including all pipeline systems that are under the Energy Transfer ownership. In this case, the Sunoco systems in Pennsylvania are part of the Energy Transfer systems, which we have oversight of. In terms of the New Jersey environmental response, as of this point, there's no indication of any releases on the New Jersey side. So at this point, there's no indication of the need for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to become involved in where there's no releases present. However, I know that the state environmental folks have had interface with the New Jersey folks I believe, to let them know what's happening. We have had a separate, we directed the operator at one point to do an investigation of an odor complaint across the river to ensure that whether there was an issue there or not. The investigation determined that there wasn't an issue as a result of that odor complaint. But of course, had there been anything related to an odor complaint or any potential for release on the New Jersey side, we would of course engage the state of New Jersey, inform them of what's going on so they could take the appropriate response. We do speak with our office across the river. The Eastern Region headquarters is there across the river in New Jersey. I briefed the Eastern Region director as to what we found in various internal meetings. In addition, of course, the local presence from our community liaisons out of the New Jersey office are folks who have been with us during the various meetings to provide some additional support and interface from the PHMSA side. So we do on occasion leverage resources in other regions who are more proximal to where problems occur. But in general, the oversight, responsibility falls on my office and with my inspectors and with our accident investigation division to ensure that, the provisions of the consent agreement, the consent order are carried out and all the investigations are done correctly.
Thanks, Brian. And I just wanted to provide a quick warning that we are approaching the 8 o'clock hour. We have about 13 minutes left, so we're going to continue to take questions in our remaining time. So, Brian, we also got a question that the NOPSO we issued in February states that Sunoco did not report odor complaints from 3 residents on 6/28/2024, 7/21/2024, and 11/21/2024. To what extent does the consent agreement ensure that Sunoco will notify PHMSA of future odor complaints? And will the consent agreement result in improved handling of future odor complaints? It took complaints from multiple residents over the course of about 16 months for Sunoco to perform an investigation capable of detecting the leak.
No, thanks, Emily. And that's a good question. So although we don't specify it in the consent agreement related to odor complaints, like I mentioned, the odor complaints were the earliest detection of the leak, of the release. If it weren't for the property owner across the street noticing the smell, reporting it appropriately, these type of things could go for a long time without being noticed. And so, for lack of a better term, the ability to smell it or taste it is in effect a leak detection capability. And so my expectation would be that as a result of the leak detection system effectiveness evaluation, I would expect that there to be comment related to, the odor complaints or the taste complaints, and for these things to be incorporated as part of what they have in their procedures related to leak detection. I will also note, and this has been discussed, is that they did a lot of boreholing and sampling with photo devices to attempt to detect the location of the release, and those weren't fully successful. And so that's another area where I expect the operator to as part of their holistic review of leak detection, is to see if there are better opportunities or better equipment from above ground leakage surveys or borehole leakage surveys to be able to better identify and characterize leak locations. The other thing I'll note, for lack of a better term, something a mentor of mine that drilled into me when I was younger. When you audit a railroad, you start with a train wreck. There was a known location of a repair in your neighborhood that the operator didn't even check initially. It took them until January of this year to look at the repair location as a possible release site. And so that's another area that we'll work with the effectiveness review to ensure that as part of their procedures, if they have a known repair location, check there. It seems obvious, but unfortunately it wasn't the case.
Thanks, Brian. So the next question I'm going to ask is, when will the report from the third-party inspection of the failed pipe/sleeve be available to PHMSA, including the size of the leak?
So the reports have been submitted to PHMSA under the terms of the consent agreement. We have those reports. I will separately note that reports that have been requested via the FOIA process have been submitted to our FOIA office. So I during my talk here, I did note some points about questions about FOIA and reports that have asked for. Everything that we have that are part of those FOIA requests you have made that have been submitted to the office, we are submitted to our FOIA office. And those have to go through the process that Emily discussed earlier. But the region, as we receive those, we are submitting those to the FOIA office, and those will be available in due course under the FOIA process. And maybe Emily has some additional elaboration there.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so we did get a part 2 to that question, which is when will the report be released in full to the public? And I know we have some other comments in the chat from folks who have already submitted FOIA requests that haven't been or that have been denied in part or in full. So I just wanted to go back to kind of what I mentioned before we jumped into Q&A. So FOIA does place some limitations on what we're able to share with the public as far as documents that we receive as part of an ongoing investigation, which, as Brian has covered, this very much is still an ongoing investigation. So I appreciate that it's frustrating to not be able to receive information in real time as it's being shared with the agency. But federal law does provide some protections for those things that are shared with us while we have an active enforcement proceeding open. So I mean, that being said, if you receive a denial from the FOIA office, I would encourage you, one, when the investigation is complete, to resubmit that request. Also, it's possible you may receive a response that tells you that we have some records available. For example, the things that are submitted to us through the National Response Center, those are things that we are able to share right now. But other records might not be available until a later point in the investigation. So it's really just a matter of the timing of the requests being submitted. We will be able to share more at the point that the investigation and the enforcement proceeding is concluded. So I'm not going to promise you that the FOIA office will be able to share things in full, because even when the investigation is concluded, FOIA does also provide other exemptions for business proprietary information and also for security sensitive information. Security sensitive information is also protected by other federal statutes. So there are unfortunately things that it's possible we might not be able to share a document in full, even when the investigation is concluded. But I can commit to you that whatever we are able to share under the law, we will be sharing. Also, if we get multiple FOIA requests for the same type of document, we do have what's called a FOIA reading room. I think most agencies maintain those. But frequent requests, we can go ahead and post those things in the FOIA reading room. So that's a process that, again, as we're able to share information and as FOIA requests come in, that's another resource that I would point you all towards. I know we only have about 6 minutes left, so I just wanted to quickly see if there are any other questions we need to address. So we got a question, Brian, about is it anticipated that you will be granting any extension of time for compliance with any terms of the agreement? How will residents be updated on the status of everything happening and included in the consent order?
No, that's a good question. So we typically within the consent agreements and consent order provide the allocation for an extension of time with good cause. I will say that as part of the negotiation process, so understanding the time that the operator needs to work with the independent third parties and then to integrate information together, we provided what I would call generous timeframes to adhere to the deliveries of these things. So based on what's in here right now, I do not anticipate having the need to grant an extension. However, there could be a case where that does come into play. But as you're aware, it took us about 2 months to get the consent agreement in place. During that time frame, work didn't stop. There were things that the operator were continuing to do ahead of the items in the consent agreement. They knew that the root cause failure analysis was going to be part of this. They knew that the leak detection evaluation was going to be part of this. They knew about the need for a type A sleeve integrity plan. So those things were ongoing. Those things didn't stop during that 2 months it took us to get to the consent agreement. And so I think the time that we have in here is as generous as the operator needs to deliver the deliverables in the consent agreement. In terms of an update, I can talk with Emily and others about the timing of maybe a future update to give you a sense for what's been delivered, what needs to be delivered, what's the timing of things. I think it's appropriate for a periodic update, but I'll work internally with Emily and my boss and others to determine when the next update might need to be. But I think you do certainly deserve updates as to our progress.
So, Brian, I think we have time for at least one more question. It seems like we still have a lack of clarity about the different PHMSA regional offices and how the jurisdiction breaks down. And I do want to make sure that people leave kind of with a clear understanding of why you're responsible for this investigation. So someone has asked, are you saying there's a different PHMSA regional office covering New Jersey, i.e. the Eastern region, or are you saying the PHMSA Southwest region has jurisdiction of all of the New Jersey pipeline?
So the PHMSA Southwest region has oversight of Energy Transfer as a company, including all of the various sub-companies under Energy Transfer, no matter where Energy Transfer is in the United States. They are headquartered in Houston, but they have assets throughout the U.S. And so we, as Southwest Region, have oversight of them. We are familiar with their procedures. We are familiar with their people. We are familiar with their operations. So we follow their operations, their pipelines, wherever they go. So our inspectors do considerable travel. I don't know that I mentioned this earlier today, but we have 4 open inspections on Sunoco assets in Pennsylvania, including the Twin Oaks pipeline, which was scheduled for this year to have an inspection. So we have multiple inspectors who have already been up in Pennsylvania for weeks, who are doing the inspections on those systems. We also have inspector, and we'll have other inspectors who will be overseeing the specific actions and activities in the consent agreement. For example, when it comes time to excavate and potentially remove or evaluate type A sleeves, we'll have an inspector there to oversee that. We may be supplemented with our accident investigation team, but we'll have our inspectors on the ground overseeing the work activities related to the consent order, consent agreements. I'll note that our Eastern Region office, which happens to be in Pennsylvania, has other operations that they have oversight of that aren't just in the Eastern Region. For example, they have oversight of the entire underground natural gas storage program in the United States. And so natural gas storage fields south of Houston or within Houston or north of Houston fall under the Eastern Region's oversight because they have technical expertise and personnel assigned to oversee those assets. And so it's based on how the agency laid out its safety program relationship with operators. It just happens that I have oversight of that pipeline system in Pennsylvania. Southern Region has oversight of pipeline systems running through Houston. It may sound strange, but it is a very effective, in fact, a more effective way to oversee operators versus having a segmented approach to doing it. It's more effective.
Thanks, Brian. So we have 1 minute remaining, and I see some questions continuing to come in about why we are not addressing questions about well water sampling. As Brian has laid out earlier in the conversation, that is not our jurisdiction. So any questions that you guys have about well water sampling or the cleanup and recovery efforts, we would refer you guys to the DEP for help with those questions. That's outside of PHMSA's jurisdiction. And I just wanted to, we're at time, but just very briefly, I know there's still some questions in here about FOIA and the security sensitive piece that I mentioned. Unfortunately, pipelines, so this isn't, I see some questions about national security. It's not a national security exemption necessarily, it's a security sensitive information exemption. And so pipeline location data is considered security sensitive. And so that's why we're not able to share specific information with the public about pipeline locations and where specific things are geographically. The amount of information we can share publicly is available via the National Pipeline Mapping System, which can be accessed on PHMSA's website. So to the extent we are able to share information about pipeline facilities, all of that is available on our website. Just anything that's more specific than what's available through that system, we're not able to share for security reasons. So I hope that that's helpful. We're going to drop contact information in the chat for our community liaison. I think many of you are familiar with Nita and have been working with her prior to this, but we're going to put that information in the chat right now so that you have it. And I apologize if we didn't get to your question. But please continue to reach out via Nita and our community liaisons so that we can continue to be as helpful as we possibly can be. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.